Hi, I'm Allison Schmitendorf, and I'm here with Tim Powers, Cal State Fullerton alum and one of the 3 authors credited with creating Steampunk. Mr. Powers, thank you for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
Tell us about your time at Cal State Fullerton.
Well, I arrived here in 1970, and at that time, every guy wanted to get 15 units because that would get you a draft deferment. But the people I ran into and wound up hanging around with might differ from students now in that I don't think any of us were interested in good careers. Everybody I knew wanted to be writers, actors, artists. I don't think many of them have followed through, but I think there was less of a feeling that college should be preparation for a job. I think most of us didn't want jobs.
How would you describe your friendship with James Blaylock and K.W. Jeter?
Well, I don't know if it was typical of the time, but the way we spent most of our days at Cal State Fullerton was cutting classes in order to sit at a table outside the Commons. And in wet weather, the table would kind of sink into the soil. And we wound up wasting our time together. And what we had in common was that we all wanted to write science fiction and fantasy novels. And luckily, there were several faculty members that thought this was not a completely idiotic ambition. So even though it was a irresponsible and even immature ambition, we all did manage to get there.
So what inspired the creation of Steampunk?
Well, a publisher in England had said that they'd be interested in publishing a series of books about King Arthur reincarnated throughout history. And they were paying very little, and it was kind of a not top-notch publisher, and so there was very little competition, and me and K.W. Jeter agreed to write books for that series. And the project fell apart because the publisher read a couple of the books and decided it was a stupid idea. But before that happened, K.W. Jeter found a book called London Labor and London Poor, written in the 19th century by a guy named Henry Mayhew. And Mayhew had devoted his life, he was a British eccentric, devoted his life to chronicling the lives and livelihoods of very poor people in London. Honest or dishonest, thieves, merchants. And he did it in such obsessive detail and chronicled it all in his books that his 2-volume book that was available alone constituted all the research one would ever need to write 1 million books set in Victorian London. And Jeter showed this to Blaylock and I and said, check this out, look, here's all your research. And so we thought, okay, and dove in. And we all were kind of pre-inclined. Jeter was already a big fan of 19th century British literature, and Blaylock had grown up on everything from Tristram Shandy to Robert Louis Stevenson, and all of us had read a lot of Dickens, of course. And all of us were science fiction fantasy fans. And so what we did, just because we had those Mayhew books, was inject science fiction and fantasy plots into 19th century London. And we each had a book or two apiece of those. K.W. Jeter's came out first with Morlock Night, which is the first book that's thought of as steampunk. There were others earlier. There was a Harry Harrison book about a transatlantic tunnel. There was a Michael Moorcock book, I think, Lord of the Air, and those were certainly what we would now call steampunk. But somehow people think me and Blaylock and Jeter invented it. And Blaylock wrote Homunculus, and I wrote the Anubis Gates, and we didn't think we were doing something coordinated or parallel. We just each thought, yeah, I'll rip off this British stuff in my way, and I don't even know what you're doing or you're doing, but let's use this up. And then, of course, we went on to write things that weren't remotely steampunk, contemporary, you know, previous centuries, all kinds of stuff. And then in 1987, Jeter said, when cyberpunk was a big fashion, well, somebody should come up with a term for what me and Powers and Blaylock were doing. Like, instead of cyber, think of steam as the dominant technology of the time. So how about steampunk? And even in '87, nobody really paid any attention. It wasn't until, what, 2000 maybe, that people somehow dug up that old remark of Jeter's and made steampunk into a lively category. And fortunately, because of Jeter's letter he wrote to a magazine back then, they have pointed to the three of us and said, you guys invented steampunk. And okay, cool, yes, fine, thank you. Well, I'll take that.
So what roles do locations have, like Cal State Fullerton and Fullerton, the city, which both make appearances in your book?
I suppose one of the things that makes any location for a book seem compelling is familiarity, that you know it well. And I think, for example, K.W. Jeter and Jim Blaylock, who both also spent a good deal of time at Cal State Fullerton, I think all of us just sort of naturally gravitate to using this area just because we can say, I know what's around that corner, I know what the climate's like, I know what sort of plants you're likely to find. That would be because of familiarity. There are other locations, of course, that you pick even if you're not familiar with them, just because they're intrinsically impressive. Like, I don't think Jeter or Blaylock or I had ever been to London, or indeed out of the country, when we were writing books set in London. But you think, well, London. And so for most locations, I know I've had to rely on picture books, travel guides, journals of travelers at the time if I'm writing a historical story. And it is real important, especially in science fiction and fantasy, because what your story is basically about is nonsense. And you don't want the reader to remember, wait a minute, this is all bogus nonsense. And so I know I really do try hard to wring all the available color out of whatever location I'm using. You know what's a good help these days? Google Earth. You can go to any, Beirut, Moscow, Shanghai, and get a street view, and then you can drop that little orange man down into the street and get a 360 view from on the pavement. Makes a whole lot of my previous research systems kind of obsolete.
So how would you describe what exactly puts the punk into steampunk?
That would be serendipitous for one thing, since Jeter simply carried the punk over whole from the cyberpunk neighborhood. But I think it fits in that our characters and their concerns and their problems were written, whether we liked it or not, from a 20th century point of view. Unlike Walter Scott, Robert Louis Stevenson, Dickens, our characters inevitably were going to be kind of late 20th century people, even if we tried not to do that. And so they probably tended to get drunk more often than was wise, or more often than even Dickens' characters did. Maybe a little more neurotic. I think it was just the inevitable consequence of late 20th century people writing in retrospect. We tried to make our characters be genuinely believable 19th century people, but I think we inadvertently, knowingly or not, did carry a 20th century quality that you could call punk back into it. I mean, we all grew up on Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones, and you can't ever really scrub that out of your perspective.
What was the appeal of making the Victorian and Romantic periods the setting for steampunk?
Good question, because what made the Mayhew books so compellingly attractive? Victorian London, particularly among historical periods you might consider, I think is uniquely suited for fantasy and mystery. You think of foggy alleyways, cobblestones, the rattle of carriages, hansom cabs, mysterious figures in capes and top hats. Obviously, Jack the Ripper is at least a shadowy figure in the background. All of the world of Dickens is hovering right there. You've got Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde just around the corner. There's something just very attractively mysterious about the idea of bells of boats ringing out on the Thames in the middle of the night, lit windows in high tenement walls, narrow streets where the buildings have little bridges connecting them at the top. It just bristles with unexplained mysteries and lends itself very smoothly to supernatural concerns. Obviously, some of the figures in the fog at night in the lamplight are ghosts. Obviously, there's sorcerers or wizards by those lights in the high windows. Obviously, some of the boats on the Thames are phantoms. I would have a hard time writing a book set in 19th century London that did not involve supernatural goings-on.
How much would you say that steampunk has shifted and grown away from its initial brainchild?
Well, if we were its initial brainchild, and with us put Harry Harrison and Michael Moorcock and probably a few others, I get the idea that it's these days got more of a political engine, a sort of self-consciously subversive element. That may not be true. I'm judging from reviews. We were innocent of all that. We just wanted to have some kind of rowdy adventure story. One way in which it has definitely moved onward from whatever the three of us were doing is that it has mutated into costume almost predominantly. These days, if, for example, you go to a steampunk convention, you go to the dealer's room, and there may be one or two tables where they're selling books, but mostly they're selling odd little gadgets with gears and cranks and attachments to your glasses and all kinds of strange rifles with Victorian pieces on them. And at the conventions, it does seem that the main thing one does there is dress up in sort of surrealistic Victorian costume, which is very cool stuff. I mean, I don't know if it has any, linear connection at all, really, to what me and Blaylock and Jeter were doing. But it's a neat thing all on its own, and they are using the same word, so cool.
Do you own any of that stuff?
I never do dress up, no. I figure, no, I'm one of the grandfathers of it. I don't have to dress up.
How would you react to someone who claims steampunk is all goggles and gears?
I'd sympathize. I think it's certainly largely goggles and gears. As I say, I think the costume and the toys, the gadgets, are a very big part of it, if not like a majority of it. I've seen computers where the keys are wood with brass, like letters inset into the keys, and cars that have been made to look like a 19th century artifact with funnels and lights and God knows what sort of additions. And it's all neat stuff. You know, when you see them, you think, God, I wish I had that keyboard. I'd love to have a steampunk looking computer like that. So I think, yeah, it is, at least to a big extent, goggles and gears. There's Sherry Priest, there's, I don't remember her name, the Parasol Protectorate series. There are a number of books that self-consciously do steampunk, but I think they're at least matched by the goggles and gears crowd.
So the character of William Blass is a fictional poet that yourself and Blaylock invented, who makes an appearance in the Nimbus Gates, and Blaylock also featured him in The Digging Leviathan. How did this character emerge, and what is his influence on your writing?
When Blaylock and I were students here in the very early 70s, the school paper, the Daily Titan, would publish poetry on the back page. And it was close enough to the 60s so that the poetry was all really bad stuff about flowers and children and sunshine on beaches. And Blaylock and I would note how bad it was, and we decided that we could write poetry that would sound very big and portentous, but which would actually have no meaning at all. And so what we would do is get a piece of paper, and I would write a line of poetry, pass it to Blaylock, he'd write a second line, pass it back, and we'd pass it back and forth this way, each writing a line. And as we got down to the bottom of the page, we would wind it to a close. And it would be iambic pentameter with mythological references. So if you read it hastily, you'd say, whoa, there's a lot of value here. And we sent a bunch of it to the Daily Titan, and they accepted it. So we wrote another lot that was dumber, and they accepted that. So we wrote a third lot, which was dumber still, and they did not accept that. But a lot of it did get published in the paper, and then as we began to write novels, we often found that we had a character who would be kind of a wild-eyed, white-bearded, crazy William Blake type poet. And so, unknown to each other, we named that character William Blass. We came up with the name because we thought he needed one of those two-word names like Longfellow or Wordsworth. And so we each thought up a syllable, and luckily we didn't make it Bless Ash. But what wound up happening is an editor who bought my book, The Anubis Gates, then received Blaylock's book, The Digging Leviathan, which takes place in Long Beach in 1950. And she wrote to Blaylock and said, do you know this Powers guy? You both have this same poet, but Powers has him in 1810 and you have him in 1950. How can this be the same guy? And Blaylock said, I'm sorry, does Powers use that name? I'll use a different name. And she said, no, go with it. Both of you do this, but think up some reason why he's still alive in 1950. And so we came up with some sorcerous, magical reason why he hadn't died. And since then, it's almost become kind of a good luck gesture to include Blass. There's a small press back east that has done the William Blass Memorial Cookbook. there have been several books published now by Blass, which ultimately I hope makes people, at least for a moment, imagine that there really is such a person. In '83, when The Anubis Gates was published, a number of people did think, oh, he must be, you know, low profile, minor, 19th century poet, that's why I haven't heard of him. And they'd maybe have to go to a library to figure out that he was not real. These days, you Google it, it instantly says, oh no, Powers and Blaylock made him up, which is kind of too bad. I sort of like the idea that people might go for some time imagining that he was a real person. Actually, I think if you Google Blass, you get more hits than if you Google me or Blaylock. He's likely to outlive us.
And finally, what advice would you like to give aspiring writers in the English MA program here?
Oh, I would say that the only thing any writer has that makes fiction they would write worthwhile is their particular idiosyncratic, unique perspective on everything. And therefore, you should, not just in order to be a good writer, but in order to be an informed citizen, you should make your perspective as widely based as possible. It's crucially important that you read very widely, not just in the area you want to write, but drama, nonfiction, poetry, history, biography, and not just now. Don't hamper yourself by reading only things published since, I don't know, 1950, 1980, 2000. Previous centuries will give you different perspectives, not necessarily better perspectives, but they'll give you alternate choices to simply the default philosophy of 2015, which you wouldn't want to be stuck in anyway. Then I would say write and keep writing and finish what you write. I used to always, every night, come home and have a few glasses of wine and get inspired, and I'd write on a piece of paper, chapter 1, and I'd write a page and a half. Think, good, that's good work. Put it in a drawer, and the next night come home, get inspired, and write chapter 1, and I'd wind up with 70 chapter 1s, but nothing finished. You need to finish it. And then, having finished it, it really is crucially important that you get it to editors, publishers. These days people will say, oh no, you don't have to do that anymore. That's back from the 1900s. These days self-publishing, get it formatted for Kindle on Amazon. That's actually, I think, a bad way to start. Your friends will buy it, get it on their Kindles, but your sales rank will wind up being like 3 million, which means that 3 million books sell better than your book. If money moves, it should move toward the writer. It should, getting a book published should never involve the writer paying to have it published. The New York publishers take forever to respond, but they'll pay you when they finally do. Or they'll reject it and you send it to a different one while you write a fresh thing to send to the person who rejected it. But ultimately you're better off with the New York publishers. So read lots. Don't restrict yourself to contemporary stuff, drama, poetry, etc. Write stuff, finish it, get it to editors, and then keep doing this. And ignore sensible friends who point out that being a professional writer is an unrealistic and not even entirely sane goal. They may be right, but who cares?
So thank you for coming to Cal State Fullerton today, back to your old stomping grounds, and answering some of our questions, Mr. Powers.
It's been a real exercise in both nostalgia and disorientation. I wouldn't have missed it.